Thank you so much, everybody, for joining Celeste and me here today. Looking forward to a really, really interesting discussion about an issue that is still really, really topical. So we're going to start with Celeste is going to be talking a little bit about the book and why the Heathrow case is so important, not just because of its impact on emissions, but also its relevance to how we tackle the climate crisis in a way that's fair to people and doesn't worsen existing inequalities. Then I'm going to talk for a bit about how aviation affects our climate, why the government's approach to aviation is rushing in the wrong direction, and how the industry is trying to greenwash its plans to keep on expanding and producing more pollution. Then I'm going to ask Celeste some questions, and there will also be space for discussion and questions from you as well. So please do put things that you'd like to ask or things that you'd like to discuss into the chat box as we go. Celeste, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ali. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It's a beautiful evening. I also know it's the night before the great big Jubilee weekend. So, great that so many people are still wanting to be engaged and not just off on holiday. So I'm going to talk to you about my book, Expansion Rebellion, which I've been writing for the last 2 years. And it's been a huge project. And at times I didn't think I was going to be able to finish it, or I just worried that it was not going to be correct or that I would have missed something massive, but I got there. So hopefully what I've produced is something that's an interesting read, a fun read, and a great narrative. I chose the story because I just found it was, as we've said in the introduction, it is a story of people trying to do something really important on climate change and having, I won't say resounding success, but a good degree of success. So it's a really good story, and it's a human story as well. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about why you should care about the expansion of Heathrow Airport. So you might have heard about these plans to expand Heathrow Airport. It's been going on for over 20 years. In 2010, there was an announcement by the coalition government just after they got in that there would be no more expansion plans at Heathrow Airport, and everybody thought that was the end of it. But unfortunately, the issue came back again in 2018. So you might also have thought that this issue of Heathrow expansion was something that only affected people who live in West London, those people who live close to the airport, the people who lose their homes, or the people who live in South London and who are experiencing overflying all day, every 90 seconds from 4:30 in the morning to 11. Or you might have thought it was only affecting those people who are breathing in the pollution from the planes, or those that experience the congestion caused by people driving to the airport, either to travel or to meet relatives. But the reason that I wanted to write this story is because it really is a story that affects every one of us around the world and in the UK. And it's a story of fairness and social justice. And the reason for this is that aviation is getting a free pass, while other sectors of the economy are being forced to come up with ever more radical plans to decarbonise and cut their emissions. Aviation is hoping to increase its passengers' numbers dramatically. We know that aviation is a carbon-intensive industry, and we know that it's hard to decarbonise, and Ali will be talking about that a little bit later. But the Department of Transport itself is still using figures that it's hoping to increase passenger capacity across the UK's network of airports by 70% by 2050. 70%? But aren't we in a climate emergency, I hear you cry? Well, we are. And this is why the story resonated for me. The lawyers who put together this legal challenge into the plans to build a third runway at Heathrow Airport tapped into something that just feels intuitively wrong. We're in the middle of a climate emergency. How do you go about expanding an airport? Shouldn't we be reducing the airport? So the third runway, the plans at Heathrow Airport would make it possible for an extra 250,000 planes to land at the airport every year. That's more than 700 extra planes coming in every day. So in a minute, Ali will be talking about the fact that aviation has consistently dodged attempts to meaningfully decarbonise. And there's no guarantee at all that this growth in passenger numbers would be carbon neutral, let alone zero emissions and negative emissions. So the question is, How can it make sense to expand an airport in a climate emergency? So the reason that I was interested in this story was because this was the question at the heart of the lawyers' thinking when they were putting together the legal challenge. In February 2020, these lawyers won a resounding success at the Court of Appeal. It was just before the pandemic hit, but it just happened at a time where I think probably most people were not so worried about coronavirus that they do remember it happening and that it had a great resonance at the time. Basically, the Court of Appeal told the government to go back to the drawing board and redraw up the plans, which was the airport's national policy statement, which was the national planning policy document for the whole of UK aviation. And this document explicitly endorsed the third runway. So the challenge that the lawyers came up with was based on the iconic 2015 Paris Agreement. And this is still our best hope of limiting dangerous climate change to 1.5 centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And I won't go into what will happen if we miss that target. So what the lawyers wanted to show that it wasn't possible to bring in another 240,000 planes to Heathrow every year, all of them belching out CO2 and other climate warming gases, and still keep within the UK's legal commitments. Remember, we're talking about net zero by 2050. That's only 27 and a half years away. So if we increase aviation, what kind of a slice of that net zero budget is aviation on its own going to be taking up? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Guess what? It turns out that the impact of the climate assessment for the third runway, the Secretary of State for Transport, which at the time was Chris Grayling, used not the flagship Paris's 1.5 centigrade target to assess the project, but the now discredited 2 degrees centigrade limit. And this was the old target underpinning the 2008 Climate Change Act. I think, maybe we'll get into this later if people don't know the difference, but I think people now really realise there's a huge difference between 1.5C and 2C. The kind of damage that we're going to do to the planet under 2C doesn't bear thinking about. But the legal case that's the subject of this book conclusively proved that the Secretary of State for Transport did not use the 1.5C temperature limit, which was what he'd signed up to in the Paris Agreement from 2015. And guess what else? It was never completely clear in the whole process of establishing the planning landscape for UK aviation if the emissions from the planes, which were actually going to use the runway, this is 95% of the projected carbon impact of the project. It wasn't even clear if those planes would be included. It certainly seems from Heathrow's early planning documents that they did not consider the plane's emissions in their calculations. Instead, what we saw in their documents was a detailed carbon neutral project for the actual building itself and the runway itself. So things like replacing light bulbs with LEDs, buying electric delivery vans, and trying to persuade people to travel to the airport using public transport. Does that sound like greenwashing to you? Well, in my opinion, it is. So you would think that someone somewhere, one of the extremely well-paid consultants who produced the documents on which the government's national aviation strategy was based, perhaps would have drawn up some really convincing modelling to show that the economic benefit of the third runway was so utterly overwhelming that the future of the UK could not be guaranteed without it. Well, that wasn't the case either. In one estimate, the net economic benefit of the Heathrow project over 60 years was estimated at £1 billion. £1 billion! The project would cost at least £18 billion just in construction costs. And that was not including the costs of abating the carbon and the impacts from the carbon on the project, which also, by the way, were not properly modelled in the original calculations because of technical difficulties. So the importance of this case that I've written about in my book is that lawyers wanted to show all of this. They knew all of this. The aviation teams from Friends of the Earth and the Plan B Earth, which is a charity run by Tim Prosland, who's a lawyer, they knew all this. They saw this. They saw the planning documents. They understood that this modelling had not been done correctly. And they understood that they needed to get this narrative out into the public realm to show people what was actually going on and how these kind of huge infrastructure projects are assessed. And they wanted to show that if the government's assessment didn't reflect its international legal commitments, then it would have to be done again, and it was in fact illegal. So this legal challenge was fiendishly complicated, and I saw my hair turn grey as I tried to understand it over the last 2 years, and had many moments where I just thought perhaps it was beyond me to understand it. But actually, the power of this story is the detail. And I believe that people living in Britain today would have an implicit faith that those who are making these decisions about enormous infrastructure projects, which will exist for generations to come after we have died, will really have done their sums, and they will be able to hold their hands on their hearts and say that they did not build something that would lead to climate breakdown. But having done the research for this book over the last 2 years, I really don't believe that they can. I've gone back to the original documents underpinning all of the things that were in the legal challenge, and I went over every claim that was made. And I really don't believe that anyone looking at the aviation industry's promise that an extra 250,000 planes arriving each year can convincingly say that this will not jeopardise the UK's climate budgets. And of course, this was shown meticulously by the lawyers. And I think that's really the power of this story. Without me hearing about this case, and I heard about it because I used to work at Friends of the Earth and I did the comms on the case, and I was just piqued by the detail that the lawyers were talking about when we were drawing up the comms documents. But I wouldn't have gone back to the original documents that underpinned the ANPS, the airport's national policy statements, and the third runway planning documents. And I wouldn't be able to tell you what I found. I would have thought there was a workable solution, but I don't believe there is. And that's no matter what Heathrow Airport tries to say about its plans for electric planes, sustainable aviation fuel, and of course, the dreaded offsetting. And I'm sure that this is something Ali was going to talk about later on when we get into how the aviation industry is actually going to decarbonise. So unfortunately, as I mentioned, in December 2020, just as the second lockdown was announced, and the UK aviation industry was hemorrhaging money because of the lack of ability to fly, Heathrow Airport went back to the Supreme Court and successfully managed to get the Court of Appeal judgment from 10 months previously overturned. Now, the thing to note here is this was an appeal by a private company. The government and the Secretary of State of Transport had accepted at the Court of Appeal stage that the policy had been assessed against the 2 degree centigrade limit and not the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit required under the Paris Agreement. And the government didn't take part in this Supreme Court challenge. So that's a private company, mostly foreign owned, funding an appeal at the Supreme Court to remove any obstacles to it gaining a development consent order, which is the piece of paper which will allow it to go ahead with the expansion. This piece of paper will help to raise its share price and will give it the right to build a runway which will significantly challenge the whole UK's efforts to reach net zero. And it will cost the UK dearly to abate that carbon. The current base, which is the Department for Business, Energy, Industry and Skills, is the government department that works out carbon budgets. Their current value for carbon is around £240 a tonne. So with an expanded Heathrow, as that third runway is actually built, the Department for Transport figures suggest that the UK aviation sector will be emitting 40 megatons a year. So if you wanted to cost all of that up under the current prices, and that's 27 years before we hit net zero, it adds up to about £10 billion. And I've already mentioned that the economic benefits before that was considered were paltry, just £1 billion. And that's partly because most of the passengers using the new runway won't even step foot in the UK, because 70% of the projected traffic through the new third runway will be international transfer passengers. But who gets the landing charges? Heathrow Airport, a private company. So I think I've said enough. I'm going to hand over now to Ali, who's going to talk about how realistic it is that the aviation industry has to plan its plans to decarbonise aviation. She's going to talk a little bit about how this is largely a luxury sector which benefits a privileged few. My final comment is, now that we've seen the benefits of virtual working and we've all had thoughts about slowing down our lives, does anybody need 70% more flights in their life? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Celeste. That was really interesting. And yeah, one of the things I found so helpful in your book was how you dug into, a very, very complicated legal case and a complicated legal process and legal arguments, and just really explained the underlying issues around this, and how the lawyers tried to make it clear that this isn't, that this is about our climate and it's going to affect all of us. And yeah, it's something that we should all be worried about. So the UK's carbon budgets allow aviation to take up an increasingly large share of emissions over the next 3 years as we get to 2050, when we're supposed to be hitting net zero. And there's an assumption not only from the government, but also from the Climate Change Committee that, of course, we have to allow flights to increase. And the only debate that they're having really is how much we're going to allow levels of flights to increase by over the next 30 years. But who actually benefits from this increasingly large share of emissions and of the UK's remaining carbon budget? Well, actually, it's not most of us, because most of us fly rarely, if ever. And when you try to talk to politicians about reducing demand, you get a lot of them saying, oh, well, we can't tell people not to take their annual family holiday in the sun. But actually, if you start looking at who is actually taking the flights, it's not about people's annual holidays. It's a relatively small group of people who fly frequently. And in fact, just 15% of people take 70% of all the flights. And even before the COVID crisis hit, half of us don't fly at all each year. And around a quarter of us fly just once per year. So most of us are consuming flights very, very rarely, but just 1% of people in England are taking a fifth of all the overseas flights. So access to aviation is incredibly unbalanced. And that means that we're allowing a fairly large share of our scarce remaining carbon budget, and an increasing share, to go to something that most people actually don't benefit from. And also something that's overwhelmingly a luxury leisure product. So these emissions aren't being generated from something which people need to survive, like heating their homes, which we're seeing people are actually struggling to do with the energy cost crisis. This is a luxury product. It's people taking multiple foreign holidays per year. And this is largely discretionary travel. It's not mostly business flights. That's another thing the aviation industry likes to suggest. It actually isn't backed up by the data. And it's also mostly not people visiting friends and family overseas. It's discretionary travel. So journeys where people have a choice about where they're going and how they get there. But what this means is that there's huge scope to reduce emissions from flying by cutting back on flights without actually impacting most people, simply by asking frequent flyers to fly less. And this is really important because public acceptance of measures to cut emissions is going to really, really depend on fairness, that there won't be public consent if people can't see that measures to cut emissions aren't fair. And what this means for aviation is that the people cutting back on flights have to be the small group of people who fly frequently, not the vast majority of us who really don't fly very often at all. And of course, as you would expect, how often you fly is very, very strongly correlated with wealth and with income level. So what this means when we're trying to think about, okay, how can we reduce demand for aviation to protect our climate? This means that you need a progressive tax rather than a flat rate measure. So if you were to try to tackle the problem of aviation emissions by, for example, taxing carbon alone, this would end up pricing poorer people who don't fly often out of the skies entirely, while allowing the wealthy to keep on flying. So it is really important to tax pollution. Sorry, I don't know what happened to my video there. Oh, there we go. So it is really important to tax pollution, but that also needs to be accompanied by a progressive tax, like a frequent flyer levy. And what a progressive tax would do is it would increase per flight that each person takes per year. So there would be no tax levied on somebody's first flight each year, or a very low tax. and then a charge levied on the second flight and a higher charge levied on the third flight, and so on. And what this would do is that it would allow aviation demand reduction to be targeted at frequent flyers. And people can see that this approach is fair. So the polling that the government has carried out shows that there's support for a frequent flyer levy type approach. And the Climate Assembly, which was a kind of deliberative process of ordinary people in the UK talking about the climate policies that they'd like to see. And that also came out in favour of a progressive tax like a frequent flyer levy to manage demand for flights. So, of course, this isn't the only measure that's needed. We also need something like a kerosene tax. So at the moment, astonishingly, jet fuel is zero rated for VAT and there's no fuel tax levied on kerosene. So what that means is that drivers filling up at the pump would pay more fuel tax than the entire aviation industry has ever paid. And you'd also pay more VAT on a bike than you do on a plane ticket. So clearly this is completely unacceptable given, we need to cut emissions, we need to protect the climate, but also given the fuel cost crisis that people across the UK are facing a really, really worrying future of just being able to unafford basic energy to keep their families warm. And yet at the same time, somebody who is flying several times a year to go on holiday is not paying a single penny of tax on that fuel. And clearly, in terms of incentives to devise a sensible system to cut emissions in a way that's fair to everyone, this just doesn't work. So the reason why aviation is so problematic for our climate is that unlike most other sectors, there's not really a way to fly without causing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is particularly the case for longer journeys. So as Celeste mentioned, organisations like Heathrow Airport, with a massive financial interest in expanding the sector, are very keen to push a narrative about how they can have zero carbon flights or carbon neutral flight or greener flights or however they want to phrase it. But it's just really, really misleading. There's various things that they're proposing as pathways to decarbonise flight. But actually, when you look at all of these things, they don't exist yet and probably won't for quite some time, or they don't work, or they're just prohibitively expensive, or they would almost create more problems than they solve. So there's alternative ways of powering planes. Electric or hydrogen planes are something the industry likes to talk about as eventually being part of the solution, but there's huge technological barriers to doing this. Batteries are incredibly heavy compared to jet fuel, and hydrogen is very bulky compared to jet fuel. And of course, if planes become much larger or much heavier, it's very hard to get them to fly. And the technical difficulties in doing this for anything more than very short flights are just really, really prohibitive. And most models accept this and realize that actually even by 2050, you won't be able to take a long haul electric flight because the technology just isn't going to be able to do it. And so because of the difficulties in this, the industry is currently very keen on alternative fuels, which they call sustainable aviation fuels, which I think is actually a bit of greenwash because they're not particularly sustainable. So there's a lot of problems with these in terms of they're not really available, they're going to be very expensive, but also whether they're actually going to reduce emissions. So if you try to make aviation fuels from crops, so that's biofuels, then what you're looking at is a really, really huge amount of land going into producing the plants that you would need to do this. And of course, that would have huge knock-on impacts in terms of deforestation, in terms of access to food, in terms of the affordability of basic survival foods for people around the world. So it's really not a solution. There's also the idea of fuels from waste, so household waste being processed into jet fuel, which is something that's technically possible. But if you look at the amount of jet fuel that the aviation industry burns through each year compared to the amount of waste, it's just completely impossible for fuels from waste to cover more than a tiny, tiny part of it. And of course, a very large proportion of waste is made from plastics, which, as we all know, is made from fossil fuels. So the idea that you're going to process this waste and put it in a plane and burn it in the sky, and that's somehow better for the climate, or a kind of meaningful pathway to stopping aviation harming the climate, is really it just doesn't stack up on any level. It's really just greenwashing. And finally, on alternative fuels, there's e-fuels, which is basically the concept that you can capture carbon from the air, combine it with hydrogen that you've got from splitting seawater, and turn it into a very clean, sustainable fuel. So again, this is technically possible. It's incredibly expensive. The cost of doing this would make flying multiple times more expensive. It's at an incredibly early stage of development, and the idea that it will be able to allow business as usual to carry on for aviation, let alone the huge levels of growth the industry is pushing for, is really just completely unfounded. And so because of this, because of the difficulties in decarbonising flights, the government and the aviation industry are having to have these really wild fantasies about technological progress if they want to try to argue that you can have growth in flights while fitting within our very limited carbon budgets. They also often push the idea that you can just remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that in just a few decades' time, it will be possible to remove millions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So again, this is just, it's a technology that I think is being actually operated at a single site in the world. It's extremely expensive. Again, if they were to do this for flights, it would push the cost up by at least an order of magnitude. And all of this stuff is just a huge technological gamble. It doesn't really, none of these things are really working at the moment in any meaningful way. And if this gamble doesn't pay off and these technologies don't come into play, but we allow the industry to expand in the way that Heathrow really wants to, then it's our climate that is going to pay the price for that. And of course, also paying the price will be people all around the world who are affected by extreme weather, by rising sea levels, by food shortages, by an increase in the prevalence of some health conditions. So it's it really is a kind of social justice issue, as Celeste said. So we're also seeing more and more greenwash from the aviation industry. So things like claiming that if you just offset your flight, then you can fly carbon neutral, which again is just, if you look at what's actually happening from an offset, whether that's planting trees or investing in renewable energy, both of which are great and we should do them, but they're completely not equivalent to just leaving fossil fuels in the ground, which is what we need to do at this point. So it's clear as well that the aviation industry can't be trusted to be honest with people about its climate impacts or to manage its own emissions. At Possible, we've just published a report on the industry's track record of achieving the targets that it set itself on emissions, on efficiency and alternative fuels over the past 20 years. And what we found is that it has missed these targets by miles. It's missed all but one of the goals around technological progress to cut emissions. But even if those targets had been met, which they weren't, they were far too low to get the sector into alignment with the kind of carbon reductions that we need. And there is an alternative to all of this greenwash and spin and hope that suddenly technologies will magic into being. And that is to put sensible limits on flights, discourage frequent flying, and ensure that people can still travel through modes of transport that can be decarbonised, like international train travel, and making sure that these are affordable and accessible. So why can't the government or the aviation industry accept that we're going to need some sensible demand management? Well, of course, for the industry, there are financial incentives. So we see this with Heathrow. Even if the expansion means that it becomes financially overextended, even if it triggers a massive backlash from climate people, from the public, then there is still that financial incentive for the airport to expand as much as possible, regardless of the cost to our climate. And for the government, it really seems to be ideological that they're opposed to demand management because they don't want to tell just a small group of people who fly often that they need to fly less, because they don't want to tell people what to do. But of course, it's actually the government's job to limit harmful behaviours which affect the public good. That is what they, are in theory elected to do. And this position is just really out of step with the ambition that the public wants to see on taking action to protect our climate, and the widespread public acceptance of fair measures to do that, like a frequent flyer levy. So at Possible, we're doing various things on this. We're currently doing a research project to look realistically at the extent to which things like alternative fuels can actually cut emissions from aviation, and the level of demand which will be possible within the carbon targets that we need to hit by 2050. And although we don't have the final numbers from this yet, it's clearly the case that we just don't have the carbon budget for any airport expansion. It's just not going to be possible without really bursting through our climate targets. We're also preparing some data on airlines making misleading claims about the effectiveness of the steps that they're taking to try to manage their emissions. And we're going to be filing some complaints about this. We're running a project called Climate Perks, which allows employers to give their staff additional days of paid leave so that they can travel without flying. And we're also running a campaign for a frequent flyer levy, which we're asking MPs to support. And we're really trying to make it clear to policymakers that actually people do want to see sensible measures to limit demand for flights from people who fly often, and not the unconstrained growth in demand that the industry wants. There's just no public appetite for those levels of increase in flights. There's no public appetite to expand Heathrow, and as Celeste has explained, allowing these airport expansions like the Heathrow third runway would come at a huge public cost, not any kind of real public benefit. So I'm going to ask Celeste some questions about the book and her findings. And if there's anything you'd like to raise or to ask, then please do put it in the Q&A. So Celeste, the publication of your book was really, really timely because the government released their plan for aviation this week, which provided a really worrying statement of support for growth in airport capacity. We had the aviation minister talking about supporting Heathrow expansion. And it just seems, so astonishing that they're still doing this and that they think this is an appropriate response to, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis. Can you tell us a bit about what the impact of the Heathrow expansion going ahead would be for our climate and the action we need, both in terms of the huge increase in emissions it would bring, including not just carbon dioxide, but a lot of other really harmful greenhouse gases, and also the impact that this would have on the public's understanding and acceptance of the need to make really urgent cuts in emissions. How can we or the government ask people to make changes to their lives to protect our climate in the face of this incredibly high emissions project that's going to cause millions of tons of additional emissions?
Yeah, so the way to try and quantify all of this, obviously, any future projections are always fraught with difficulties, particularly when we're talking up to 30 years and beyond. Obviously, we know that we can't even really predict what's going to happen tomorrow. So obviously all of the projections come with a degree of uncertainty. But the Department of Transport have used consistently and used in the court case, the legal case that I wrote about in the book, a figure of 40 megatons of carbon dioxide being emitted by the UK aviation industry as a whole in 2050. If Heathrow expansion went ahead. So that was including all the extra planes from the third runway. So that figure obviously is 40 megatons of carbon dioxide being emitted in 2050. It's not zero. The aviation industry would basically be allowed a degree of being able to overspend on net zero because everybody accepts that aviation is almost impossible for it to be completely decarbonised by that time. But the Climate Change Committee, their advice now on the aviation budget is 23 megatons by 2050, and that would then require huge amounts of carbon removals, and you've talked about that already. That was one of the lovely figures that I found in my book, was that the current carbon removal technology that exists is in Iceland, and it's removing, I think, around 4,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. The average private jet user is emitting 7,500 tonnes of CO2 per year on their own. So that would mitigate just half of a private jet user's current consumption. So you can see there's a huge disconnect between the fact that we're envisaging with the third runway 40 megatons of emissions from aviation against 23 megatons of what the Climate Change Committee is asking for. So I think I feel like that's important in itself, to get the message out to people and to understand that disconnect, and to understand that in all the other industries, in transport, in agriculture, in buildings regulations, all these other industries are being asked to do everything they can to be net zero by 2050. And aviation is already not being asked to do that. And I feel that that's important. And part of that's just to kind of tell this narrative and just to get people to understand the scale of what we're talking about here. I think one of the difficult things when I sort of gathered from doing my research about sort of early attempts to get people to decarbonise aviation was that it was always felt to be a small sector, particularly when the Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1996. Aviation was much smaller as a global sector, and people thought, well, it's the least thing we need to worry about now because not that many people are flying. And I guess nobody predicted the level of how flying would explode over the next 20 or 30 years. And so that's kind of one of the reasons it was always left behind. But the other problem you've got is that it's difficult to know where to quantify the emissions. So should you charge the emissions to the country where the person has flown from? Should you charge the emissions to the country where the person is flying to? Should you charge the emissions to the nationality of the person who's flying or the nationality of the company? And none of that's really been satisfactorily worked out as well. And so that's another reason why aviation falls through the cracks. So I think really what the book is about is trying to tell people how aviation falls through the cracks, and to show just in one project, which of course is a huge iconic project that everybody knows about, to just show how that actually plays out with one particular project, how the maths doesn't really add up, and what a huge impact that one project would have when everybody else is working so hard. So I would like to think that, in my small way, just telling this story and be able to articulate it and to just show the hard work of the lawyers who put together the story, the lawyers at Friends of the Earth and the lawyers at Plan the Earth and all the other, the Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London's lawyers, and all the other people that took part in the challenge. Just showing that they've been doing these calculations, and they've been working it out, and just to get that out into the public knowledge so that people don't just assume that there is an answer. I think that's really hopefully part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's often the sort of assumption that aviation can have a bit more of the carbon budget because other sectors will pick up the slack. But if you look at how other sectors are doing on hitting their own targets, there's no slack there. They're, if anything, underperforming. So, it's a kind of problem across the economy that we need to do more. But it's certainly not going to be the case that there's just going to be all this additional carbon budget just lying around for a small group of frequent flyers to just carry on regardless. The book tells the story of the court case around trying to get the expansion plans thrown out on the grounds of climate, and specifically the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, which was a tightening of the previous target of 2 degrees, and that meant that the UK had to change its emissions targets from 80% reductions to net zero. And this was really one of the first cases of its kind. Can you talk us through what happened in the case and how the lawyers tried to hold the government accountable, and how they tried to make it put its climate commitment into practice in terms of limiting high emissions projects?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the extraordinary aspects of the story and the case was when the airport's national policy statement was passed in 2018, there was a parliament vote and Parliament backed the airport's national policy statement, which explicitly endorsed the third runway. Back in 2018, the climate targets, as you said, were the old Climate Change Act from 2008, which at the time that was passed in 2008 was groundbreaking and was, the envy of the world that we even had any targets. But that was based on a 2-degree target limit. And that was an 80% reduction on 1990 levels. By the time the case got to court, a year late, just 9 months later, Extinction Rebellion had hit the streets, Youth Strike for Climate had hit the streets. Everything kind of suddenly hit the news that, the Paris Agreement was saying 1.5 degrees was, absolutely the limit that we must respect. Otherwise, we'd be facing catastrophic climate breakdown. We had the International Government Panel for the IPCC, I'll call it, so I can never remember what the acronym stands for. We had the IPCC report from late 2018, which made that difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees explicit. So suddenly everything changed very quickly, and the court case was heard in March 2019. And then on the very same day that the court case was thrown out at the High Court and they lost in the initial round at the High Court, that was the same day that the climate emergency was declared by Parliament. And that was in response to the Extinction Rebellion and the Youth Strike for Climate, who were protesting outside Parliament at that time. So we had this extraordinary change in the national scene, which happened as the case was going on. So you kind of started with the lawyers with this hunch and their knowledge, because they were campaigners and they understood and they'd been following it. Friends of the Earth had been campaigning on Heathrow expansion for years. They knew, and they knew that the government knew as well. But basically, it all tried to get pushed through before this net zero was going to come in and before the Paris Agreement was going to come in, and the 1.5 temperature limit. And it all happened as the case was going on. So, the spectacular irony was that at the end of the whole process, when the Supreme Court verdict came in, which overthrew the Court of Appeal verdict, it was then more than 1.5 years since we'd committed to net zero. And you had the lawyers in that case on Heathrow's side still talking about the 2008 Climate Change Act and the 2-degree limit being the correct limit, because that was the law as it stood at the time. And everybody who was in the courtroom, it wasn't courtroom, it was virtual at that time, but everybody who was following that case knew that net zero had come in the interim. So it was really interesting case at that time. And I, we were chatting a little bit about this before. I don't think that there will be another case on those precise details, because now that net zero has come in, the 1.5 temperature limit is effectively in UK law now. So you can't challenge anything on the sense that government decisions won't be made on 1.5. So, it was kind of a moment in time where suddenly everything was coming together. And your aviation or climate campaigner, Leo Murray, who was former Plain Stupid and well-known aviation activist, said to me, and I think it's a really relevant comment, was that this case was just intuitively correct. It just felt wrong. It was a climate emergency. How can you expand an airport? And it just hit a time, a zeitgeist where things really were changing. So I think that, that was really one of the most interesting aspects of the case. And when it comes to how the lawyers put it together, they, again, like I said, the people who've been following aviation for years, and there've been previous legal challenges. So, these guys know their stuff. I'm saying guys, they're not all guys and girls. I'm using guys in a sort of open sense, but, they know their stuff and they've been following it for a long time. So they had, a good hunch that, they hadn't really considered the 1.5, because it was impossible. Because even if you didn't consider 1.5, aviation's budget was still 37.5 megatons at that time under the old 2-degree limits under the Climate Change Committee. And I've already said that the Department of Transport was saying that aviation would be emitting 40 by that point. So even before you start, you were 2.5 megatons over your budget. Obviously, the aviation industry would argue that they could mitigate that by offsetting, but still you have a problem even before you have the net zero. So another extraordinary thing that happened in the case was the lawyers kind of had a sense of this, and they were sure that must have been the case because there was no other way that they could have, the Secretary of State for Transport and the Department of Transport officials could have argued it. And actually, in the pre-court hearings, just before they got into the court, a Department of Transport official under at the beginning of these cases, they always have to disclose evidence that's relevant to the case. A Department of Transport official actually said, yes, we did use the 2 degrees centigrade limit, and we did that because we were told on government legal advice that that was the correct piece of legislation. So we weren't able to use 1.5, so we did use 2 degrees. And that was extraordinary because that happened before the High Court happened, and basically they admitted, yes, we did. And in the first round of the case, they still lost, and it was thrown out by the judge in the High Court. And then in the second round at the Court of Appeal, which was in February 2020, that's when that point finally came across, that the government had said itself, yes, we did, that is what we did. And there were reasons for that, because they were told that it would be illegal to do anything else, but that is what they did. And then again, like I said, the other extraordinary point was then on the back of that, when it went to the Supreme Court, it was Heathrow, a private company, was bringing that challenge. It wasn't the government. The government said, yeah, fair cop, we did use 2 degrees, sorry. And Heathrow said, well, okay, but that's irrelevant, and, challenged it on other grounds. And basically it was thrown out again 18 months after the net zero commitment had come in. So, there were so many fantastic sort of ironies and seminal moments as the landscape was changing. And again, that was just, this case just kind of weaved through all of this amazing stuff that was happening. Just made it a really, really good story.
Yeah, something I think really came across in your book was how sort of disjointed a lot of the policy making was around this. That on the one hand, you've got a government that wants to, quite understandably look like it's leading on climate internationally. But then when you start to dig into not just its policies, but how it makes those policies, there's this complete disconnect in terms of actual, in terms of willingness to actually cut emissions and willing to make the decisions that involves. And because of that, we're seeing that it's not really living up to the claims that it's making on climate. It must be really sort of almost like frustrating to be kind of like, sort of mired in that bureaucracy and trying to, come up with an argument within the constraints of what the legal system will allow you to argue, which I also found really fascinating, that you can't just go into court and tell the government, well, your climate commitments are inadequate. You have to be able to construct an argument about, well, you didn't follow the due processes and the legal requirements to do this. Was that something that you found quite difficult as someone coming at it from, I guess, more of a climate perspective than a legal angle?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, and yes, there were many points that I kind of realised very late on that somebody had said something to me very early on, and I'd obviously completely missed what they were saying. So that was a real challenge, actually, to get my head around that. But yeah, what you're talking about is basically in the UK, the only way that you can challenge government decision making is through a judicial review. And literally all the judicial review can do is say whether the decision was made in accordance with the law. So you can't challenge the merits of the decision. You can't challenge, in the case of Heathrow expansion, you can't go in and say, well, there's a climate emergency, this doesn't make sense. You know that we can't do this because it's wrong to be considering expanding when we need to be, reducing our CO2 emissions. But the only thing you can do is say, well, and this is what they did do. The case was constructed on the fact that the law said that the designating these national policy statements, which are basically the national document which says this is what we want from aviation in the UK over the next 50 years, that document needs to be designated with international commitments in mind. It doesn't specify which international commitments, but clearly an international treaty signed by 194 countries is, of the utmost importance. And I mean, it's very obvious from very early on when you look back at the text of this airport's national policy statement from 2018. There's no mention of Paris. The only mention of Paris is talking about Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris and how that's threatening Heathrow's status as a hub airport in Europe. So, you know, in the sort of annex of the document, it does refer to international obligations, but it never mentions the Paris Agreement. And I felt that that was explicitly done. You know, we're saying we haven't looked at Paris because we've never said anywhere in here. They didn't lie and say we did look at Paris, and they didn't. You know, they never mentioned Paris. And so that was what the judicial review was based on, was the fact that in order for this policy document to be designated and voted on by the Houses of Parliament, as it was, you had to have taken into consideration these international treaties. And that was what was another extraordinary outcome of the case, because as I said before, the Secretary of State said, we didn't. And yet Heathrow was still able to successfully appeal that. So it goes to show, you know, and there were very valid reasons for that. You know, the case at the Supreme Court, you know, you can see the reasoning, and, you know, no lawyer was challenging whether, you know, that what they'd come up with didn't make any sense. I mean, obviously people wildly disagreed with the kind of confidence that was conveyed upon the government's commitments to cutting carbon, particularly in the aviation industry. But actually, you know, there was a clear legal argument why it was overturned. So this is kind of one of the things that's very interesting as well, is just these legal cases do have this massive resonance, as I was saying about Leo's comment about, you know, they kind of have a zeitgeist moment. And if they work well, they force everybody in the public to have an opinion on whether they think airport expansion is a good thing or not. But when it comes down to it, the actual case is so fiendishly complicated and based on so many tiny technical points of law. You know, it was a real challenge to write. But, you know, one of the really good things that came out of the case, which is, you know, kind of slightly minor point, but actually I think really important, is, you know, for the purposes of this development consent order, which is the piece of paper that Heathrow would hope to get if it puts in an application to go ahead with the third runway, it would be hoping to get a development consent order. And at this stage, there should be a full carbon impact assessment done. If this piece of paper gets the go ahead, then Heathrow will be able to say, you know, we've done all our calculations. And actually that is still unclear how that process is going to happen. It's still unclear exactly how those carbon impacts are going to be quantified, whether they're going to be monetary impacts or not. So I think that, you know, there's still a lot to play for at that level, where the DCO, if it goes to that level, if that's going to come in or not, how that works out, how Heathrow works it out. And you know, another point that I think is just also worth raising is just, why are we allowing a private company to make decisions about the UK's climate budget? This is just one private company that wants to maximise money for its shareholders. They can say, well, okay, we're going to do all this sustainable aviation, we're going to limit the impact. But they don't know what Bristol Airport's doing. They don't know what Manchester Airport's doing. They don't know what the agriculture sector in the UK is doing. How can they argue coherently that they know the full landscape of decarbonisation across the entire UK economy? It's a private company. So obviously, you know, you were asking me before, would there be another legal challenge? I mean, I feel that if this development consent order gets put through and actually is approved by the government, I'd be astonished if the lawyers don't come back and say, you know, this is the next step of our challenge, and what's been achieved in this challenge and what came through in the judgment from the appeal court and the Supreme Court is some really clear lines in the sand now against which to assess that, which the previous cases have now sort of established. So they have been laying the groundwork for what they will do in the future. So that's really one of the most important things. And one of those kind of stakes in the ground that they want to kind of be sure about, and that they have established now, is that it will be the carbon budget at the time that the application is put in. And even at the time of the appeals court verdict, it wasn't entirely clear whether, because the airport's national policy statement was designated in 2018, would we be assessing this development consent order against the 2018 target, which of course, as we know now, is 2 degrees centigrade, or will we assess it against the target as it is at the time, which is now 1.5? And the appeals court verdict did establish it would be 1.5. So things like that, tiny little, points that were made as part of the argument will be used in future for future challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that really came through in your book as well is that the impact of this case isn't just about the legal judgment, the eventual ruling, or about the points that were raised, even though, as you say, some of them did provide some really useful legal arguments that hopefully people will be able to use in the future, but that it was also just such a strong kind of expression of the climate justice arguments and the social justice arguments, and that even the act of a group of essentially, concerned citizens sort of banding together, instructing lawyers, trying to challenge this is in itself a really powerful process, and that it brought a huge amount of attention to the climate problems around airport expansion and all the issues with this project, and that in terms of raising public awareness and public understanding, that's also something that's been a really kind of positive step forwards.
Yeah, I mean, I like, my background is as a journalist, so I'm all about the narrative, and that's why I was really fascinated in this case, because it did manage to encapsulate so much stuff. And when you go into the detail, you're like, almost every single point that the lawyers kind of told me, I was kind of like, I don't really understand this the first time I heard it, and then sort of second or third time I heard it, I thought, okay, I can sort of see what they're saying. By the time I finished, I was like, yeah, they nailed it on every single part, and it was so complicated. But actually, what was lovely about it was the story, as I was saying, that it happened at this time when the climate emergency was declared in Parliament. The verdict came out on the same day. It just had this resonance, this sense of how can we be going, we're saying that all this stuff, we're committing to these laws in principle, but we're not following through, so it's all very well to say one thing and do another. And I think, that's what, is where we need to be kind of putting the pressure now, because, we've said some really great things, and the UK has really kind of been a climate leader on paper. If you look at the 2008 Climate Change Act, no other country had any legal targets like that at the time. It's really great that we did that. We've done a lot of cool stuff that we now need to follow up on. And I think this is the problem. I guess you'll know much better than I do, but, I think we're really sort of approaching the hard stuff now. The electricity, decarbonising the electricity grid was not difficult. Like it's still not finished, but it's happened without any impact on people's lives. And we're now starting to kind of get towards the idea that, people will have to make changes. And, that's part of what I liked about the story, was the narrative of explaining why we need to be worried about aviation, because it does seem a bit of a side issue, but actually when you get into it, it's huge. And I'm really grateful to my editor at Manchester University Press, because he was the one that came up with the title Expansion Rebellion, which I think is just such a great title. I was a bit worried that Extinction Rebellion might get cross with me, but so far no one said anything. But what we were trying to get across through that title was this was a rebellion against the idea of expansion at Heathrow, but any expansion. It was an idea that, like, we can't, do we just keep going on growing everything and building infrastructure, forever? Because, we know there are finite limits, we know there are planetary boundaries, but, we can't just keep going on like this. And I think that's why I think the title is like really powerful, because it was, kind of a visceral rebellion by the lawyers against this idea, this narrative of perpetual growth and perpetual expansion. So yeah, I think that's really what the power is the power of the story, really. And the challenge was getting past all those really complicated details. And I know it is a detailed book, but I felt that people needed to be allowed to judge for themselves, and I didn't want to skirt any of it. I wanted to show what I'd learned from the research. So yeah, it's sometimes I'm sure there's some complicated chapters in there, but I think it's all relevant, and I think it just shows how much work went into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly found that, it was a really, really clear and understandable explanation of the legal issues. But yeah, what also came through is just that these lawyers were really motivated, not by, wanting to dispute some, obscure legal point. They were motivated by concern about our climate. And yeah, as you say, it was around the time that Extinction Rebellion was really taking off, and more people were just saying this is complete madness, that we can't keep on carrying on with business as usual, which assumes that, we can keep on emitting, we can keep increasing our emissions, and there's not going to be any consequences for our climate. That I think more and more people are saying, hang on, we can't do this. And there's so much more kind of public support and public acceptance for measures to limit emissions than our government at the moment is willing to take forward. And it's clear that legal challenges are going to be a really key way for people to try to push back on that. I don't know if you've been following any of the other challenges against airport expansion that have been taking place. And my impression is that it's really, really difficult for local groups to make much headway because, as you've mentioned, the national planning situation for aviation is just so sort of detached from reality, and that unless people can show that a single airport project will, single-handedly burst the UK's carbon budget, the courts or the local planning process can't really stop it. And of course, it's the kind of cumulative impact of all the high carbon infrastructure, all the airports, all the airport expansion, which is the issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, we talked about this idea and there was this phrase hiding in the 20, which was what people used to say about the 80% carbon reduction budget, which was basically 80% reduction meant that 20% somewhere, 20% of the economy did not need to decarbonise. And what happened was that lots of companies and industries felt, well, okay, we won't do it because somebody else will do it, which is obviously why net zero is a powerful concept, because it means everybody has to do it. But absolutely, that then transposes onto this sort of the picture of UK aviation as a whole. But interestingly, I mean, I think you may know the figures better than me, but I believe that if we had kind of all of the UK current capacity, I think it's something like 375 million passengers. And I think the projected demand was 365 million passengers. The point is, it's just kind of theoretically in the wrong place. So, there's I understand there's quite a lot of capacity still at Manchester Airport and Glasgow Airport and other ones, but it's just that because so many people come through London, Heathrow is massively over capacity. So, you do get these questions of like, well, regionally, is it going to be part of the levelling up agenda to have these regional connections? But, again, you look at that and even that doesn't really make much sense. Heathrow has 9 connections with the UK, with UK domestic regional airports. Amsterdam has something like 18. So it's actually easier to get to a regional airport from Amsterdam than it is through London. So why does Heathrow, they claim that's an important part of their expansion agenda as well. So again, this is, this is going to come out, I think, in, the next few months, as, you were saying about the Jet Zero strategy, which is the government's strategy on how to decarbonise aviation. When that comes out, how do you balance the need between all of the regional airports? The Climate Change Committee have said explicitly no net expansion anywhere. So, okay, Heathrow expansion can go ahead, but that means a contraction at Bristol Airport. Southampton expansion can go ahead, but no new third runway at Heathrow. That's all got to be worked out. But yeah, there's no clear plan on how they all impact each other. And yeah, there's a split between some of the bigger airports fall under the airport's national policy statement, but the small regional ones don't. So they have to use an entirely different planning landscape to try and work out what the impact of their emissions are. You would think that the national planning policy document would answer those questions, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I think at the point about domestic connectivity, we've seen a really backward step from the government in terms of actually cutting taxes on domestic flights. And that's really out of step with what some other countries are doing in Europe, which is trying to move away from domestic flights and towards train journeys. And there's no reason why we can't have domestic connectivity in affordable trains in the UK, but there's just not the political willpower for it. And yeah, just picking up on your point about the 80% emissions reductions and hiding in the 20. Are you at all concerned that the whole net zero framing is almost allowing something similar to happen? Because it's very easy for airports to say, well, okay, somebody else will do the net, somebody else will do the emissions removals, that will all come online later. And, you know, in the meantime, we'll keep on policing, and we can just balance that out with, you know, with removals at some later stage. It just seems like such a get out clause for high carbon projects.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges of writing this book was that I wasn't able ever to speak to Heathrow Airport. I tried several times. I even had the director of sustainability, I even had his direct email, and he did answer me once and pledged to set up a meeting, but we never managed to do it. And I hounded them on Twitter. I mean, I tried, but I wasn't ever able to speak to them. So all I could do was just take their publicly available documents and try and work out what they were thinking. So absolutely, I mean, that they will have some clever people who will have some good answers on, you know, technical fixes. They'll have some good answers on airspace modernisation. So, you know, things like better air traffic control. They will, I'm sure they will have some stuff on carbon sequestration and peatlands. The Heathrow Airport have bought a huge chunk of peatland in Lancashire, and they want to regenerate that to try and suck up carbon emissions from that. They will invest in all technologies. I mean, you know, and I don't, the question is, you know, how much do they really need to be taken into account on that in terms of will they deliver it, or, you know, to what extent will the government just accept what they say? I mean, I think that's, you know, that's really where the question is, because, you know, I think you can theoretically argue anything in terms of carbon removals in the future. But, you know, somebody somewhere in the Department for Transport will have to be making the decision about whether they think those things are correct or not. And I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I think if the development consent order comes along and is granted, I think there will be, you know, there'll be like legal challenges into how that decision was made, and that's when people will start really arguing about the figures. Yeah, I mean, it is really worrying the extent to which this kind of guilt-free flying narrative is moving around, because, you know, it's like the Aviation Environment Federation, which is a really good NGO that I relied on a lot. You know, they said to me, it's like, it's not, if you take the flight and then pay somebody else not to emit the ton of carbon, you know, you haven't emitted 0 tons of carbon, you've emitted 1, not 2. But that, you know, that's, people are not thinking that. You know, people think, well, I just didn't emit any carbon because somebody else didn't emit the carbon. I mean, things like that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, somebody's going to be playing with those figures, aren't they? So. Yeah,
it's so misleading, and I think almost the role of the legal challenge is to try and get that accountability into the system, because we can see at the moment that it's just not there. There's no mechanism to limit emissions from aviation. There's no mechanism to make sure that airlines or airports actually deliver the reductions or the removals that they say they will. And so it really seems like going forward there is going to have to be a role for further legal challenges to try and hold them to account.
Yeah, I'm sure. I wondered whether should we address, I think there's a couple, I'm not sure there's 1 or 2 questions. I'm not sure if Alice was collecting the questions, or
yes,
you can see something in the chat bar. But
I think there's some questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. So thank you to people who have put questions in. So there's a question from Joanna and Cal about the potential for jobs to be created from Heathrow expansion, and also on whether the foreign ownership of the airport makes any difference to the project.
Yeah, so I think that in the Airports Commission, which was the sort of original document that paved the way to the Airports National Policy Statement in 2018, there was kind of a consultant's report, which was written before that. I think there was around, I think it was something like 70,000 jobs would be created, and baggage handling, you know, cafeteria services, you know, passport control, all that sort of stuff in the airport. So yeah, I mean, there will be jobs created from that. I mean, one of the things that we've seen recently is, in the last few days, has been this chaos at the airports because there's not enough staff at the airport. So, that also shows you that the airports will lose those staff if there are any other problems in the future and it's not particularly secure work, and people can easily lose their jobs and not be looked after by the airlines. So, you have to take the total number of jobs promised with a pinch of salt. But yeah, absolutely, that it will create jobs. When I talked about the economic value, the assessment that was done as part of the Airports Commission in 2016, that included jobs as one of that was one of the benefits to the UK economy. And as I said, even when they took that into consideration and, the sort of cost of the landing charges and the tax paid by Heathrow on the landing charges and other things, they still, the Treasury benefits analysis was coming up with this figure of 1 billion. I'm sorry, and what was the second part of the question? I've forgotten.
The second part was about the foreign ownership of Heathrow, which you mentioned in terms of, I think, the lack of accountability in terms of the UK's overall carbon budget. But do you think the fact that it's foreign owned makes a difference to the accountability?
I don't know about that. I mean, I suppose my point was more that it's a private company rather than that it was a foreign owned private company. I mean, yes, I guess probably it may mean that they have less information. But I think my point was just that, if you're going to make decisions, as we were just discussing about, how you allocate the remaining carbon budget between regional airports, for example. So if you want to, if you follow the Climate Change Committee's advice and you say, okay, no net expansion, but you can expand at Bristol, but not at Gatwick, for example, you have to be able to quantify that, and you need to have access to all the information to know whether your project is going to be equal to the project that would be lost somewhere else. So I think that was my point, just would a private company have that knowledge or that information? Would they have, the detailed modelling required? I mean, I'm sure they would, because they would find it. Heathrow is owned by a subsidiary. It was partly the Singapore Investment Corporation and Ferrovial, which is a Spanish owned firm, and then there's a kind of parent company that owns the rest of it. I didn't get massively into the Heathrow debt structure and how it raises debt and how it operates as an organisation. But, I know that it is heavily debt leveraged. So I know that, they are borrowing a lot of money against the company. So in that sense, I think having this piece of paper, if they do get to the point of the development consent order, that that will help them, because they'll be able to use that as a future promise in terms of what they'll earn. I mean, I guess there's a question like, does it, does a foreign owned company, is it working entirely in the UK's interests? I mean, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I suppose you could argue it either way, couldn't you?
Brilliant, thank you. And then there was another question about the lack of VAT on kerosene, and whether that's partly to do with the effect of international competition. We're certainly seeing a lot of those arguments coming from Heathrow in terms of the expansion being needed to maintain international competitiveness. So the question is there a move towards international tax fairness in aviation, and who is leading that?
I don't know. You might be able to answer that better than me. I mean, all I would say on that is, basically in 1944, the Chicago Convention, after the Second World War, they agreed that aviation fuel would not be taxed. I mean, it was such a tiny proportion of any economy, then it didn't matter. And obviously now that it's not taxed, there's not one country in the world that's going to stand up and say, well, we're going to tax it, because then everybody would stop going to that country. But I don't know, do you know anything about current attempts on that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the EU is actually taking some steps towards starting to tax jet fuel for flights within the EU, which seems like a really positive step, but they've recognised that it's actually a kind of complete distortion of the market, because it's, as well as being a huge subsidy to aviation, a huge essentially public subsidy, it also means that aviation is much cheaper than its real costs, particularly compared to other forms of transport which are less energy intensive and less polluting. And I think that's something that we really see being an issue as well, that people, even if they might want to take the train on climate grounds, you know, if it's cheaper for somebody to fly, then it's really difficult for people to make that decision. And so if we had a sort of more balanced tax system for aviation, and it didn't have all these, you know, unfair and distorting subsidies, and some of its actual costs to the climate were more priced in, then yeah, it might be a situation where it's easier for people to choose less polluting forms of transport. And we have a question from David, who says that given that the case was ultimately lost at the Supreme Court, was it a waste of our time and energy? And I think we've talked a bit about how it wasn't, in terms of, you know, setting some really important you know, points that can be raised in future challenges, and also the public narrative around it. But what are your thoughts? Was it a waste of time and energy? Do you hope to see more legal cases against the aviation industry being brought forwards?
Yeah, I mean, obviously on a personal level, I was pretty disappointed with the Supreme Court victory. It somewhat challenged my narrative, which would have been that this was a really, you know, seminal, important case. The Court of Appeal victory was, you know, was huge at the time, and you know, maybe I should have thought about the possibility of a Supreme Court challenge, but I just kind of thought, well, I'd do it anyway because it was such a great story. So yes, you know, not only for me, but obviously everybody who took part in the case, it was very disappointing. I think, you know, I think that speaking to the lawyers about it and sort of following it as it was going on, you know, I think they always knew that Heathrow Airport was going to go to the end with it, because, you know, this whole kind of threat of expanding the airport's been going on for 20 years and they've never let go of it. You know, they've been beaten back several times. I was saying in 2010, the coalition government said that was it, no expansion. And then 2 years later it was back. So, you know, they want this expansion. So I think, you know, the lawyers knew that there was a very good chance that Heathrow would go ahead. I think that at the time, they thought they might manage one. Basically, there were 5 grounds that were challenged at the Supreme Court, and they thought they might get one of them would still stand. And that was actually, we didn't talk much about this, but was about the non-CO2 warming effects of aviation. So, you know, for people who don't know, aviation also emits things like water vapor and soot and particles which stay in the atmosphere, and they kind of they basically make the aviation warming more problematic. They think it's up to 3 times as much warming comes from the non-CO2 effect as from the CO2. So, you know, aviation has this extra impact that people don't think about, and that's because it's high up in the stratosphere, and, you know, there's other atmospheric chemistry going up there. So the Friends of the Earth lawyers thought that their ground on that, which was based on the precautionary principle, which basically is well established in UK law, that, you know, you shouldn't do something just because the evidence of the harm is absolutely incontrovertible. You know, you should basically tread with caution if you think there may be damage and that you won't be able to right that damage in the future. So they thought that would stand, and then it didn't. So they lost on all grounds. So was it a waste of time? I mean, all NGOs who kind of engage in legal action have this discussion with themselves about wasting their own time, wasting their campaigners' time, wasting their supporters' money, wasting their donors' money. You know, if they don't win a case, you know, lots and lots of stuff, and often organisations, Friends of the Earth is one of them, will spend everything on these cases, and then if they lose them, obviously, you know, supporters may turn around and say, well, we don't want you to lose our money, so we're not going to go along and support that. So yes, it was a big risk. I mean, I don't think so from my telling of it, because, you know, when I understood, I was saying before, the narrative power of this story, and the fact that it happened when things were becoming obvious that we were going to need to act, and that 1.5 was under threat, and, you know, there was a huge difference between 1.5 and 2. I think that sort of narrative power of this case being about that difference between 1.5 and 2, and admitting that the government was not doing what it was obliged to, I felt that was really powerful. And I interviewed the CEO of Friends of the Earth at the time, Craig Bennett, and, you know, he was great. He has a lot of, you know, really good one-liners that he throws around. And, you know, one of his comments was just, you know, whether you win or lose, it's the kind of court of public opinion. which matters. And that's kind of what Leo's point was about, was just basically suddenly people had to make a choice. Well, do I think that there should be airport expansion or not? So, I think the narrative power of that case was not a waste of time. I mean, obviously, it would have been much better if they'd won, and that would really have been the end of it. And I think that's the part that everybody is dreading now is kind of round 10 of Heathrow expansion, because it's not going away. And that's one of the, early on in my book, I describe it as a zombie. But, people have thought it's been over many times before. I mean, I think the way it might go is just that there's going to be a delay, I think, for a while, because, no matter what Heathrow says, their finances are not in a great state at the moment, and they would be obliged to foot a large part of the bill to construction costs. And I'm not sure they're going to, and, there's been various newspaper reports that the parent company is not going to lend anything else to the company for a while because they're in such a bad financial state. So I can't really see them being in a financial position to go ahead with it right now. And I think possibly by the time they do put the development consent order application in, we're going to be even closer to 2030 than we are now. We're going to be even closer to that 78% reduction that we're legally obliged to by 2035. So it's going to get harder. The longer it doesn't happen, it's going to get harder. So, if the legal challenge only succeeded in slowing it down a bit, then, great, because if there hadn't been that legal challenge, they would have had the development consent order in 2019, probably. But, because there was a legal challenge that then went on, and then there was a pandemic, we're now in 2022 and they still haven't put it in. They were planning to start construction and be finished by 2026. So, it's been delayed. So I think, that's another really powerful thing.
Yeah, I think in the book you framed it as around, well, we might have lost this battle, but that doesn't mean that we've lost the war. And I think as well, there's definitely value in just not allowing these kinds of, incredibly carbon intensive projects to stand unopposed. And that, as you said, even if we just manage to, push it back and delay it, that's still, that's still something valuable. And it's, it's much better than just, standing back and letting them get on without. Celeste, is there any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up? Any concluding?
No, I just wondered whether maybe you could quickly articulate the non-CO2 warming better than I just did, because, scientific aspect of it's quite challenging for me. So, I mean, I know you probably know a lot more about it than I do, just so that people understand this 3 times warming thing, because it's really important.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, I'm also not an expert on this, but that when any kind of jet fuel is burnt, it produces carbon dioxide emissions, but it also produces all these other impacts as well. So nitrous oxides, water vapor, it changes the way clouds form in the atmosphere. And all of these effects are quite complicated, but there is now a relatively clear consensus that the total warming from aviation is around 3 times the warming of jet fuel alone. And because of this, some of the measures which are proposed to tackle the climate impacts are actually, even if they did tackle the carbon impacts, which they won't, that's still only addressing 1/3 of the total warming. So even if you plant a tree and that, stores all the carbon that you've emitted from your flight over, the next few decades, and even if that tree isn't cut down and doesn't burn down, you've still only addressed 1/3 of the problem. And the same for removals as well, that it's, it can only ever be a very partial solution to the problem. And that's not really something that's been properly addressed by the people who are proposing these technological solutions.
Yeah, I mean, the non-CO2 warming aspects of it, they don't appear anywhere. I mean, even the Climate Change Committee hasn't really said very much about it. The Jet Zero strategy seems to be kind of continue to be worried about it, but don't do anything about it. So it's, for me, that was it. And that was something that was, that came into really clear view in the case, actually. And that was really, people started to understand that. So again, I think that was worth it for that alone.
Yeah, and I think as well, there's been, as you were saying, a sort of an argument that, we don't understand it perfectly yet, and so let's just ignore it and do nothing about it. But actually, that's completely not, not properly understanding something yet isn't an argument to just ignore it and see what happens. It's an argument that we need the precautionary principle and not to just, allow it to carry on while we see just how destructive it's going to turn out to be.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Les. That was such an interesting discussion, and thank you so much to everybody who attended and joined us and asked questions. And thank you so much as well to Alice and to the bookshop for hosting the discussion.
Thank you both so much for joining us this evening, and thanks to everyone who's been in our audience as well. It was a really lovely conversation. We will be recording this event and it's going to go up on our YouTube in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to catch up or watch back on anything, it will be available. In the meantime, we would love to see you in the shop, and you can buy Celeste's book through our website if you're not in London. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and yeah, good night from us.